Within the annals of American crime, no woman has ever rivaled Mrs. Chadwick as a mastermind of frenzied finance, writes a 1906 Ohio newspaper. Before Anna Delvey's name became synonymous with financial fraud, there was Cassie L. Chadwick, also known by several aliases including Elizabeth or Betty Bigley, Louise Bigley, Lydia Scott, Mademoiselle Mary Rosa, Mademoiselle Lydia DeVere, and Cassie L. Hoover. She was hailed as the female wizard of finance and was considered one of the most notorious con artists in the history of the state of Ohio. Over the course of her life, she managed to swindle approximately $633,000 and wreaked havoc on an entire state's financial system, not to mention all the many people she bamboozled in the Gilded Age of America. According to some people, Cassie Chadwick is the perfect inspiration for a storyline in the Gilded Age HBO TV series, where Maud Beaton cons Oscar Van Rhijn out of his money. All the while, he thinks he is the one who is going to marry the secretly illegitimate daughter of Jay Gould to obtain her fortune. There is an excellent article that lays out all the devious details of Maud's purported scheme. I left a link to the article below. Once I read this article, I have to agree it sounds plausible. But for now, let's look at the life of the most notorious female con artist in 19th century American history. And you decide for yourself if the strategies she used to con people out of their money match what we know of Maud Beaton in the Gilded Age. Born as Elizabeth Betty Bigley in 1857 in Eastwood, Ontario, Canada, Cassie's beginnings were modest. She started her life of the con at only 14 years old when she opened an account at an Ontario bank using a falsified letter of inheritance. She was caught and arrested, but she put on such an act that she was declared insane and released shortly after. Cassie also had a habit of creating business cards, proclaiming herself as an heiress to a fortune of $15,000. Using these cards as collateral, she made numerous extravagant purchases, as shopkeepers assumed that someone who was pretending to be an heiress wouldn't carry such cards with them. Cassie's criminal record dates back to her teenage years, when she was imprisoned in an Illinois penitentiary for her involvement in fraudulent schemes. Eventually, she made her way to Ohio, where she embarked on a long and lucrative criminal career. Upon her arrival in Cleveland in 1880, Cassie briefly resided with her sister before renting a space on Garden Street, where she began practicing as a clairvoyant under the alias of Madame Lydia DeVere. A few years after settling in Cleveland, Cassie married Dr. Wallace Springsteen. But much to Cassie's dismay, the local paper published an article about the couple's marriage, which brought forth numerous people who came to claim the money Cassie owed them. Consequently, Springsteen kicked Cassie out of the house and filed for divorce after paying off her debts. Their marriage barely lasted 12 days. After her divorce, Cassie began practicing as a clairvoyant again, this time using the names Madame Marie LaRose or sometimes Lydia Scott. It wasn't long before she married again, where she spent a few years in Trumbull County living on a farm with her new husband, J.R. Scott. But farm life didn't suit her at all. 4 years later, Cassie divorced Scott with the intent of taking up her old ways in the city. Once back in Cleveland, she is said to have married yet again, this time to a businessman named C.L. Hoover. Cassie and Hoover had a son, Emil, who Cassie sent back to Canada to be raised by her parents and siblings. In 1893, Hoover died, where Cassie then tried her hand at a new trade, running a brothel on the city's west side. As luck would have it, it was here that Cassie met her next husband, a wealthy widower doctor named Leroy Chadwick. Knowing of the doctor's recent loss, Cassie played the part of a genteel widow who ran a respectable boarding house for women. When Leroy Chadwick responded that the establishment was a well-known brothel, Mrs. Hoover fainted. Once revived, she claimed that she would never run such an establishment. She begged the doctor to immediately take her from the building, lest anyone think she was complicit in its operation, which, of course, he did. They quickly married, and Cassie was finally in a situation where she had money and status in the Gilded Age society. Yet it wasn't enough. It was during this time that Cassie began her largest, most successful con game, that of establishing herself as Andrew Carnegie's daughter. During a visit to New York City, she set the trap where she ran into one of her husband's acquaintances, a lawyer named Dylan. She asked him to accompany her to Carnegie's home, and they set off by carriage. At Carnegie's house, Cassie contrived to visit with Carnegie's housekeeper, while ostensibly trying to check credentials to hire her own housekeeper. When Cassie came back to the carriage 20 minutes later, she serendipitously dropped a piece of paper. Dylan took it up and noticed it was what appeared to be a legitimate promissory note with Carnegie's signature for $2 million. Only when Dylan promised to keep Cassie's secret did she reveal to him that she was Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. Cassie's story was that Carnegie was so racked with guilt that he showered huge amounts of money on her. Cassie also claimed that there was $7 million in promissory notes tucked away in her Cleveland home, and she was to inherit $400 million upon Carnegie's death. So what did Dylan do? Well, of course, he arranged a safe deposit box for her to keep all her valuable documents, because what else is a man to do but help a lady with all that money? Just as Cassie had planned, the information of her wealth and inheritance leaked to the financial markets in northern Ohio, and banks began to offer their services to her without her ever having to lift a finger. For the next 8 years, she used her fake background to obtain loans that eventually totaled around $2 million, $65 million in today's currency. Cassie Chadwick relied on the assumption that no one would ask Carnegie about an illegitimate daughter for fear of embarrassing him, and the bankers just assumed that Carnegie would vouch for any debts and that they would be fully repaid once Carnegie died. It all worked like a charm. Cassie carried out a lavish lifestyle as a result of her con. She bought diamond necklaces, enough clothes to fill 30 closets, and a gold organ. Much like Mrs. Astor in New York, Mrs. Cassie Chadwick became known as the Queen of Ohio society. She claimed to give money to the poor and to the suffrage movement, all the while making sure that she did enough conspicuous consumption that no one could possibly question her wealth and status or the veracity of her claims. But alas, it could not last. In November 1904, Cassie received a $190,000 loan from Herbert B. Newton, a Brookline, Massachusetts banker. Newton was shocked when he learned of the other loans Chadwick had received and called his loan in. Cassie could not pay, and the bank sued. At the time, she had accumulated debts over $1 million. It was also discovered that a number of securities being held for her in various banks were worthless. When Carnegie was later asked about her, he denied ever knowing her, and further stated he had not signed a promissory note in more than 30 years. Cassie fled to New York, but was soon arrested at her apartment at the Hotel Breslin and taken back to Cleveland. When she was arrested, she was wearing a money belt containing over $100,000. Leroy Chadwick and his adult daughter hastily left Cleveland for a European tour when the scandal broke. He filed for divorce before leaving on the tour. The news sent shockwaves through the Cleveland banking community. Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, which had loaned her $800,000, suffered a massive run that forced it into bankruptcy. In March 1905, Cassie Chadwick was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud a national bank and sentenced to 10 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. Carnegie himself attended the trial and later had the chance to examine the infamous promissory notes. "If anybody had seen this paper and then really believed that I had drawn it up and signed it, I could hardly have been flattered," he said, pointing out errors in spelling and punctuation. "Why, I have not signed a note in the last 30 years." The whole scandal could have been avoided, he added, if anyone had bothered to ask him. Cassie Chadwick died on her 50th birthday in the Columbus Penitentiary, October 10, 1907. Right now is the perfect time for another awesome video about the fabulous, fierce, and feisty women in history.